Powered by Cooper Parry, the rebels of accountancy, this is the No Bull Podcast.
No Bull Podcast.
Our purpose, to disrupt, lead and make life count. We help entrepreneurial, like-minded businesses to thrive across the UK. Your podcast host, Steve Whittle.
Why are we doing a Brexit business update? For most of us, Brexit has divided the country and the topic has been banned at the dinner table along with religion and politics. For those in business, it's a subject that needs discussing more. Businesses are pissed off with the lack of guidance from the government and how to trade with the EU. In December, they dropped in too much information and this confused all companies. This created a lack of confidence with them and in advisors, and some advisors took advantage by charging for unnecessary services. We need to get back to basics, simplify and create a model that works for people. And by the end of this podcast, you'll know what questions you need to be asking your advisors to make the most of your post-Brexit business. I'm joined today by Damien Shirley, a tax partner at Cooper Parry. He's an expert in tax and Brexit business issues and has firm opinions about how businesses should be treated. We'll meet him shortly. Before we do, let's meet our guest co-host, Helen Channer. Helen is a tax expert at Cooper Parry, and we'll make sure we keep Damien in check. And we'll make sure we glean most important information from him. Hey Helen, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, thanks Steve. Looking forward to today, and I'll do my very best to keep Damien in check. I think the last 12, 13 years of working together has put me in fairly good stead to keep him under control, but can't promise.
No, I know Damien, and I'm with you. And Damien, it's so great to have you here. At Cooper Parry, our purpose is to disrupt, lead and make life count. I'm fairly confident that is you all over. But please, by way of introduction, what do you do to disrupt, lead and make life count?
I knew you were going to ask me that, Steve. Disrupt's a bit of a funny term, isn't it? Because a few years ago it would have been all about tech disrupting, whereas I'm a bit of a Luddite. And I think I disrupt these days I'm told I disrupt because I still use my Mont Blanc fountain pen. I buy vinyl, and I'm told I'm disruptive from doing that these days.
For the listeners, at today's date of recording, we're about 6 months on from the end of the transition period and the date when Brexit really became a true thing that people needed to be aware of and working out what on earth they do. Looking back to the lead up to Brexit and the final months of 2020, how would you describe the position that businesses found themselves in when they came to their preparation stages?
Yeah, it seems a long time ago now,
Yeah,
after the last 6 months.
Lots changed.
Oh, a lot has changed. I think if I track back, we had obviously the pandemic going on as well, which was far from helpful. And I can remember good old Boris talking about getting Brexit done. And I guess it was always going to be painful when it was done. But at the time, I was thinking, please, guys, maybe just give business a few months more. Just try to get through, obviously, the difficulty that the world has been facing at the moment. But they didn't take that up. I thought that was odd because businesses just didn't have staff on the ground, and many furloughed and many at home and so on. So that for me didn't help. But I do respect the fact that the voting public wanted Brexit to happen, and it was going on for too long, so it had to happen at some point. But for me, I think there was a large period right through from the vote all that time ago, right through to probably about the 24th of December, where there was just a lack of information from my angle. It made it really hard for businesses and advisors alike, and businesses were getting letters from government just saying, yeah, get ready for Brexit. TV campaigns with people, the man on the ground or the woman on the ground just sort of, banging a hammer or doing something and just saying, are you ready for Brexit? I certainly am. And I was thinking, well, I want to employ these people because if they know what's going on, then they're gold dust, So I don't think the TV campaigns helped. Advisors, some advisors were saying, well, prepare for a no-deal Brexit. Now, I don't know whether I agree with that being the right move, because in my view there was always going to be a deal. There was always going to be some sort of deal. It would have been a political bombshell for the UK, and I think the EU has got so many markets where they're reliant on the UK pharma, automotive and so on. There was always going to be some sort of deal, but what the deal would be, we all waited to see. Preparing for a no-deal Brexit is a really intrusive thing to do, a complete change in your supply chain and so on, ended up, very costly exercise, time consuming and perhaps not worthwhile. So I had clients who were trying to prepare for what the world might be. Some clients just saying, well, we're doing absolutely nothing until we know for certain what's going on. And then sort of came into December from my angle, we're starting to then just build some insight and think, well, what the hell are the clients going to do here? And on around the 15th or 18th, I don't know whether you remember, Helen, but some stuff started for me, some guidance started coming through for Northern Ireland, where I think people just thought there was going to be frictionless trade with Northern Ireland. It's a big deal with the kind of wider political ramifications around that. And then some guidance was announced which laid out requirements to have some sort of establishment in Northern Ireland, and also for applications to be made by the 31st of December, when people were about to sort of shut down for Christmas after what's been a tough year. So I go into the kind of updates and found around 75 updates in one day. And it looked like customs had just dropped this sort of, or the government, I should say, dropped an information overload upon businesses to say, well, hey, here it is, see you next year. And I know many businesses saw that and just thought, well, we can't take any more. It can't be this bad. And one client said, well, let's just suck it and see. We just want to do no more. Trade, a common comment was trade isn't going to stop. It's just not, things aren't going to stop. So let's just wait to see, come back after Christmas and see where we stand. So a real period of uncertainty, and then more uncertainty through information overload. We then came back into the new year, and everybody thought, well, is this going to be a sort of Y2K non-issue? Things seem to be sort of going quite smoothly. Goods were entering the EU, goods were coming into the UK. There seemed to be a bit of a lull for 2-3 weeks in January, and that I think that was because not many checks were being done on the borders, and so people were under the assumption that everything was okay. But it's a kind of weird world that we live in on the regulatory side. If people aren't checking that things are working, then things can't work because nobody's telling you that they're not. So we then come into sort of February, March, into even into today, and people started needing to submit their reporting requirements to meet compliance requirements overseas and so on, and needed to get all important documents from freight forwarders and different people to allow themselves to be compliant, recover their import VAT, reimburse freight forwarders for customs duty and different things, and everything seemed to go to shit, if I may. If I'm allowed to say that, Steve. Sorry.
Of course you are, yeah.
Sorry.
Be disruptive.
I'm being disruptive, there we go.
You're being a bit naughty, but hey.
Helen, you should have warned me, shouldn't you? We need some bleeps. Sorry about that, everyone. It did go to shit, though, to be honest, because people realised that things that they thought were in order weren't so. So they hadn't worked out with their supply chain who was going to be the actual importer of records, who was going to be responsible for imports and exports, who's going to have the right to VAT recovery, people not understanding, getting it wrong, people expecting to recover costs from the government that had been incurred when goods went into the countries, but actually they were the wrong person to do so, and so on. Other points then coming up where people started getting goods blocked at the borders because they didn't have the right authorizations in place and the right representation in different countries. So we've seen, worryingly, a sort of ever increasing amount of issues coming into play for businesses as they're hitting reporting deadlines. I think the reality hits of what they need to do. So we had a bit of a lull, then a peak period, probably a bit of a lull again, but people now coming in, now the dust has settled a little bit, just to kind of do things properly at this point on. So a real journey for business right through, and for advisors alike as well. So tough times really.
Was that just a few businesses though? I mean, because you had said that all those 78 points dropped, so surely if they just nailed those 78 points, majority of businesses did that, didn't they? And then most businesses weren't getting stopped at the borders?
Well, yeah, it's the nailing of the 78 points. It's the understanding of the 78 points.
Yeah, because it wasn't as simple as 78 points. It was 78 briefings of varying length, 1 page to 100-page documents. And the date at which they dropped, the businesses were just like, we've not got the people on the 24th of December, or whenever the official deal was finally announced, to say, actually, let's get our head around what all this is saying. And I think something that I've observed from quite a lot of clients was there was a spectrum from the clients who just hung their hat on the deal being some kind of panacea and everything would just be fine and things would carry on the way they'd always done, to clients at the other end of the spectrum who we're sort of taking the view we're not going to get a deal and everything's going to go to hell, but we don't know what to do and how do we prepare and what will the rules say. And we probably ended up somewhere down the middle with the deal that we got. But the speed at which we went from no information to an avalanche of information just didn't give the businesses the time to get their heads around it.
Yeah, I agree completely. And the deal itself was interesting because that came out, I think, on the 24th, was it?
Yes.
As a Christmas present and a celebration. And within that, there was, if you're a business, if there were to be a deal, you were kind of expecting it to be a free trade deal of some sort with the EU, which in essence it is. But actually hidden within the deal are a number of real complex requirements which dictate and decide whether the goods that you're producing, so you're buying raw materials from overseas, you make something, you might distribute something into EU countries. These real complex set of rules will decide whether or not these items are duty-free when they go into the EU, which has a massive impact on the commercial pricing that you're charging, and equally who's going to be incurring the customs duty, both in terms of being the formal importer. So, you, Steve, you're a customer and I import to you. One of the two of us has to be the person that actually is the importer of record. It's called the person that is responsible for filling out all the forms and paying it in the mind of the government and who the government would go to if it wasn't paid. But then on top of that, if that was you, Steve, you might say, well, it's all well and good because I'm over here in a country in the EU, so it's kind of easier for me to do, Damien. But actually, I wasn't expecting to pay this amount of money, so you got to pay me back under the commercial contract that I've got with you. So yeah, I'm happy to pay it as far as the government's concerned, but I want it back from you. So these conversations couldn't be had before the 24th of December because nobody knew what the kind of parameters were and the rules of play that everybody was dealing with. I touched on Northern Ireland earlier. I was pretty shocked as an advisor, with the sort of knowledge of the wider issues around the Good Friday Agreement and the tensions that are in place, that, and the talk of there being frictionless trade. When I saw reference to there needing to be some form of establishment in Northern Ireland in order to be able to move your goods into Northern Ireland, that in its own right I knew was going to cause problems for clients. And the government since has offered a concession which allows you to get out of that, but only till November this year, so there's going to be more difficulties moving forward. One point actually that springs to mind, Steve, is we did have some clients that, if you look at our world, Helen and I, we deal with customs duty, VAT, but there's a whole raft of other regulatory requirements that come into play now that we've left the EU. And so we might say to a client, leading up to Brexit. In fact, I had a drinks manufacturer who said, I'm going to get out of all this Brexit mess. I've spoken to my distributors around the EU and they are going to be the importer and they'll deal with all this mess. And because I'm not importing into the EU, then I'm covered. Happy days with this. I just can walk away from it. I said, that's cool. What are your trade terms that you have with the customer? Because I think there's 11 or 12 different ways in which you can trade. There are different rules which decide who's responsible for risk here and there, who's responsible for insurance matters, who's responsible for transport and different things. So I asked them, well, what terms of trade are you using? And they said, well, we've never heard of terms of trade. What does this mean? And we talked through that and got them into a place where the customer was truly the importer under their trade terms. And what that meant for them in terms of our world on customs duty is that they'd remove themselves from this Brexit mess, if I can call it a mess, to be honest. They deal with an export, customer is dealing with the import, and the UK supplier just has no further dealings. That's all fine until you move into wider regulatory issues such as product labelling and product conformity. So, and every good that is sold into the EU has some sort of product conformity requirement attaching to it, particularly consumer goods, which can range from very slight or nil requirements, they might be kicked out or exempted, through to some real complex requirements that go alongside it. So if you take this drinks manufacturer, they needed to place upon their label who the responsible party was, the person was that was representing the company in the EU. So this UK supplier didn't have an establishment there. and they needed somebody to be their representative on the continent. And it turns out that the regulations say, well, whoever is the importer is the responsible person. So there they were in our customs world with us saying, hey, you've removed yourself from all these customs issues, import VAT issues, because you're not the importer. But they're now opened up a product labelling issue because the person they'd agreed to be the importer in our tax world then became the person that had to go on their product labels and be effectively liable for any issues around the compliance of the drink. Something went wrong with the drink, if there was some issue, a health issue with it or whatever, it would be the distributor that would be the first port of call for the regulator. So obviously the distributor would say, well, we don't like this, so they'd look for kind of collateral warranties and indemnities from the supplier, but equally the drinks manufacturer might say, well, we just don't want somebody else to be our face on the continent. So I feel, what I felt is you sort of put one piece of the jigsaw in place and then another piece falls out of place. It's one of those little puzzles where you have to move little slides around, I've found Brexit to be one where you need to have a coherent set of advisors, a collaboration of a number of advisors. So we work with regulatory specialist lawyers, and as do many other firms, but pulling everybody together that is needed to get trade from A to B. It's not, this Brexit isn't a tax issue. Brexit is a supply chain issue, a regulatory issue, and yes, a tax issue, but just thinking about one area is wrong. You've got to think about the whole piece. But generally, those that were not deemed the importer have had an easier time than those that have thought, well, okay, we're going to improve customer kind of confidence. We're going to be the importer. We're going to just take all the hassle out of our customer base around the EU. We're going to trade on terms where we, the supplier, become the importer in different countries. Then we sell them on in a like-for-like manner, i.e., if we have competitors around the EU selling to these customers, we want to be in a place where we are like for like. Excuse me, against those suppliers that we're battling against to do business. And those guys, in my view, have had a real tough time of it, and they're the ones that are suffering still today.
The No Bull Podcast with Steve Whittle.
So you've covered a lot there in a very short space of time, as has the business world. They've had a lot to get their heads around. We're now 6 months down the line, and some might think that the teething problems should have started to work themselves out now and things start to be a bit more clear. Would you say that's a fair comment, or are businesses still struggling? Are they still pissed off about, well, how does this really work for us in reality?
I think I think it's tip of the iceberg stuff for me. We're seeing more and more issues come about. I think governments as well. I mean, I've got some sympathy for government because the public voted for this. Great, Brexit could be a great thing for the country. I'm sure it will be. But everybody had to work out what the new world was going to be. Governments as well as business, as well as advisors and so on. And I think that the idea that things were going to be resolved on Jan 1 is actually Jan 1 was the date at the end of the transition where people started to work out, where everyone started to work out, what the world was going to look like. And I think for me, the one that stands out, which is hitting the press at the moment, particularly with the G7 summit and the tension it kind of took over that, is the Northern Ireland Protocol with the Good Friday Agreement sitting behind it. I had huge concerns leading up to Brexit that this was being ignored or pushed to one side. For me, it was going to be the issue, not just because of the political issue, but because it's a route for goods to go through and enter the UK or enter the EU. It's a mainland kind of border, which is always going to be, it's going to raise concerns for the EU because it's open to abuse if people want it to. So I understand they had to be super tight on that. So obviously we have this, effectively this sea border, and the complexities for moving goods between the EU and Northern Ireland in particular, between the UK and Northern Ireland in particular, they're huge. Even from that advisor's angle, I think there was some further kind of rules and updates that came out in April, which are now being kind of looked at as businesses are moving their products. And as an advisor, actually writing, a note to help businesses understand what they need to do and don't need to do and what forms they have to fill in and how they go about their dealings for goods to be, they have this term, not at risk, so goods aren't at risk if they're going to stay in Northern Ireland. And one would think there could have been a simpler way of resolving this, but you could imagine the kind of politicians and litigators around the table at the 11th hour trying to sort of tick off every permutation or risk that might come about, and then that created this arduous kind of number of rules and conditions.
And let's not forget that the Northern Ireland Protocol might say one thing, and it's supposed to all be fully enforced now. But the UK is unilaterally extending and putting delays into certain things.
Yeah.
And that's what's causing a lot of the tension, because the EU is saying, well, this should be fully enacted by now.
Yeah.
Why are you not following the rules that we agreed on?
Yeah, I've got a personal issue. I need to be careful, Steve. If you take me down that path, and I've got a real issue around sort of, as a country, we need to be the kind of like a figurehead on morality and adherence to international law. And I'm not saying we're not, clearly, but it does raise a question mark, or it's good press to think whether we're actually pushing against pre-agreed international law at the same time as we're trying to do, good around the globe. It doesn't sit right with me. I think that, a deal was done, however complex it is, a deal was done on particular terms, and dare I say I've got some sympathy with the EU on that particular point, because it's, if the UK wins through, then it's made it very easy for countries to leave the EU. And I think that, there will be some real contenders for that in years to come. So I don't think the EU is necessarily... Position is going to get a little bit worse from November, because the simplifications around needing establishments or not over in Northern Ireland are going to come to a close. But then by that point, we might have a completely different protocol to what we have now. Who knows? The issue for me as well with Northern Ireland is the talk of trade wars. Are the EU going to remove some of the tariff-free arrangements that we have in place, as a form of sanction to get the UK to fall into line and adhere to the international rules that the EU say we've agreed to? I mean, I find the Northern Ireland piece hugely difficult to contend with, and I'm sure businesses do as well. What's still annoying businesses, rules of origin, I suppose, the thing that, again, which I saw, which doing what we do, Helen, when Brexit came about, my mind went straight to, well, we won't be able to sort of send stuff across tariff-free. There's an extra cost to business here, which people just weren't understanding. And still to this day, if for example, you buy in some goods from a third country and you're a distributor in the UK and you import them, you're deciding what to do with them. Do you sell them in the UK? Do you move them into the EU? You can end up with double duty hits there, which just didn't exist before because we were in a single market. So there is a set of rules which sit within the trade agreement, which dictate when you can and can't move products from the UK and into the EU and back and so on, to answer the kind of question on whether there are tariff quotas attaching to goods. You've got to really get down sometimes to the component elements of a product, right down sometimes to looking at, say, the composition of particular metal items that might sit within the products, or the processing, the form of processing that they undertake, the extent of the processing that might occur in the UK. So as an advisor to businesses, I'd encourage them really to, they need the right people on board to understand some of these points, and I think businesses are just learning that. So they need, people from manufacturing and from procurement just sort of getting under the skin of what these products actually kind of, how they're made up, how they're produced, what they're produced from, just to help the business then work out the rules and understand whether they have this tariff-free trade, which, as advisors, is really interesting work. I'm sure other advisors feel the same, but it's kind of intrusive. You get to know an awful lot about the business, but that is becoming ever more difficult.
The No Bull Podcast.
Well, I think that's a really key point, because you talk about, and I completely agree, the rules are quite logical when you start to work through them, but I think a lot of it is about perception. And when the deal was announced, it was being hailed as a tariff-free deal. And I think businesses that weren't used to importing from around the world, who would say EU purchases only, they were having this sort of played out to them like, oh, there is no tariffs anymore. And the reality is quite different. And I don't think the mainstream media has helped, because they've equally gone with this very wide message from the government that, oh, it's okay, we've got a trade deal, and most goods, they won't have tariffs on them. And I think most is far too wide a simplification, because the reality we're seeing is that isn't playing out in truth.
Yeah, I completely share that. And I think that I can understand that when we were back in the EU, if you bought products in from third countries, there'd often be tariff quotas on them. Some do, some they don't. And some countries, they'll have preferential trade agreements. So, developing countries can move products into the EU tariff-free. But we leave the EU and there was this sort of misunderstanding, as you say, driven by the government and press saying, there'll be this new UK trade tariff, which is going to be bigger, bolder and better. But the truth is that if you take preferential trade agreements with other countries, where clients might have been happily importing from these countries duty-free, they expected these preferential trade agreements to continue under the UK tariff now in place that they were relying upon for that first import into the UK, and that's not the case. So they were getting caught out there. And then secondly, some are paying tariffs when they enter the UK, but then having to pay tariffs again when they enter the EU. So you've got that extra limit. I think that was missed. The one for me, Helen, which is really, it comes up, the more you work with businesses, the more you see these things. And the one that I really struggle with, and again, I know businesses do, is we've got a couple of clients where, we've got a client who produces T-shirts, prints T-shirts and so on. So T-shirts are coming in from Portugal to the UK. So they come in from the EU. There's a small amount of work done on them to the UK to print them and put labels on and this sort of thing. And then they go back out into the EU to the customers. So they kind of start in the EU, they originate in the EU, they come into the UK, small amount of work is done, and then they go back out into the EU. So we're supposed to have this trade agreement in place to facilitate trade between the UK and the EU. You'd think, well, that's fine. And the first link, getting them from Portugal to the UK, is absolutely fine. But actually getting them back into the EU is then a problem. And it's a problem because we don't do enough work on them in the UK. If we did more production on them in the UK, then they would satisfy the rules to go back in duty-free, which is just beggars belief. The complexity and the logic behind that I really struggle with, because in my view, you've got a kind of ring-fence production chain which starts in the EU, dips out to, the UK under this free trade agreement that we have with the EU, but the second limb back into the EU is then problematic, despite the fact that the T-shirts just haven't really changed. They've just had a logo or a label put on them. So for me, I struggle with that, and that's hidden within the free trade agreements. And I think there's just a couple of lines in, a huge amount of customs guidance which invites you to look at whether there's a whole different set of rules on return goods relief, and it invites you to work out whether you're compliant in some other area that's kind of like disconnected in a way, or it's only partially connected to the free trade deal. And you've got businesses that are trying to, they're trying to just sell their products. I mean, this is what frustrates me with anything. It's not a Brexit thing. It's generally with, some of the regulatory change. I don't know whether they really understand, government understands what this means for people on the ground. If you got a business that simply wants to trade, you go back to my point at the start, in the middle of a global pandemic, the sheer complexity around this stuff is tough. We see in other areas, freight forwarders and some of the difficulties they're having and so on. So I think, back to Steve's point, have things settled in the last 6 months? I think this 6 months has been the kind of like, the guinea pig period for people to work out how to then make things settle. And some things got easier, some things just continue and get more complex, such as Northern Ireland, as I touched on. So, it continues to be tough.
Powered by Cooper Parry, the No Bull podcast.
So Damien, freight forwarders, I've heard you mention this a couple of times now, and I can't be the only one who doesn't know what that is.
Yeah, you're not far from it, in fact. And freight forwarders move shifty goods from A to B. And I feel for them, to be honest, because leading up to Brexit, I think there was a heavy amount of reliance placed upon freight forwarders because they move the goods and they're at the ports. But I can't recall which freight forwarder it was, but there was some LinkedIn video I saw with this poor freight forwarder saying, well, who says that we know what's going on? These are new rules. Yes, we shift your goods, but it doesn't mean that we're the oracle of all things Brexit. But unfortunately, business does put them in that place, and whether that's justified or not is a moot point. Perhaps with the bigger freight forwarders, these global kind of household names, one would think that they should have been aware that there was a need for them to be absolutely all over these rules and to offer, a holistic package of services. And I think they do. But the issue is, from my angle, is actually when people are talking to the freight forwarders, they don't quite know what to ask them. And what we see in, what's quite common is that you might have, in fact, we have, if I give an example of a clothing retailer trading in multiple different countries, they worked heavily with a kind of household name on the freight forwarding side, but they were dealing with a UK contact, and you had a client who didn't fully understand what to ask, speaking to a UK contact who was actually assigned to deal only with the export side, getting the goods out of the UK. So goods were landing then in the different countries, and the wrong messages had been passed to the team on the freight forwarder side on the continent. So they were filling out documentation incorrectly, placing the wrong parties down as to who was the importer and so on. So our client was expecting to be the importer in the other countries. They were paying the freight forwarder for import VAT that was incurred when the goods landed, and they were expecting to be able to recover that 3 months later through their kind of local VAT returns. But none of that worked out, and it took that client, along with the freight forwarder, over a month to work out just what had gone wrong, let alone how to fix it. And what had gone wrong is that you had a freight forwarder who, their main kind of objective was to get the product to the customer. So what they did at the other end was to change the documentation in order to get the goods through. So what our client wanted to do would have blocked the goods at the ports, and the freight forwarder decided without any consultation to therefore override what the client wanted to do and just shift them to their customers, and that's created in the first 3 months £155,000 cost for the client for various reasons. And what the client said was, well, we'd have much preferred to know that there was a problem at the port so we could have fixed it and had a slight delay in our supply chain of what are non-perishable goods, as opposed to just incurring this cost and only finding out through the way the kind of processes work some 2 or 3 months down the line. We find that a great conversations with freight forwarders involve their kind of teams, not just in the UK, but also teams on the ground in the country in which you wish to import. You need both limbs in a conversation and everybody agreeing who's doing what, who's responsible for what in the supply chain, by which I don't just mean the business, I mean your customers as well. You need to work out who's actually down for doing what. So we've done loads of diagrams, loads of boxes and arrows, working out who's doing what for who. Get that agreed with your supply chain, get that agreed with the freight forwarder, make sure you're all using the same language and understand what different terms mean, make sure the freight forwarder can actually offer the services you need them to offer, and get that absolutely cracked before you send the goods out. So freight forwarders, I think, it's not their fault, but they're a key part of the supply chain. So if you can't get that limit of it right, then you're going to get a problem there. So a lot of our work stems from that.
Powered by Cooper Parry, the No Bull podcast.
So Damien, I totally agree, and I think that example is really key for demonstrating how it can be the case that freight forwarders can be part of the solution, but unfortunately there are situations where they've become part of the problem. You touched on unexpected costs, 155,000 I think you just said. How do businesses take things to the next stage? Because businesses are wanting to know that they're not going to have these unexpected costs and that goods are going to move in a timely fashion through their ports. And you were starting to talk about communication being key. And could you just elaborate on exactly what it is that businesses could do to take them out of the headache and bring them back into a much more better way of running their business?
Yeah, I think running their business is kind of key with this whole piece. I think that this is all a supply chain conversation. It's not necessarily a Brexit thing. I think businesses should be doing this anyway. To work out who needs to do what where, you need to pull apart your supply chain and work out where you as a business trade, what you're trading, who your suppliers are, who your customers are they business to business, are they business to consumer, work out where you want to be immediately, work out where you want to be in 3-5 years, use Brexit as a kind of catalyst to, really sort of redefine your business if you want to, because, the kind of C-suite are going to kind of be really invested. If there was ever a time to do it, it's now. Once you've pulled that apart and get some advice on that, the best advice that businesses could have would be to support that business in pulling apart their supply chain and working out what they do where and where they make their money, where they don't make their money. And we've had some amazing conversations with clients over the last few months, which are really rewarding for us, and I'm sure other advisors feel the same. But for the businesses, they've paused and they've actually stopped trading in some countries because they realised they weren't making any money there, and it just hadn't been on their agenda to do that pre-Brexit. Don't be driven by the tax agenda. Don't be driven by all this kind of insight you might find on the web, contradicting views about what the tax position might be in different countries. Don't be driven, in my view, by a transfer pricing expert coming in and saying, hey, let's look at the kind of like optimum corporate tax position or VAT positioning. So I think the best advice from me is to use your advisors and invite them to just pull apart your supply chain, work with you to pull apart the supply chain and work out what they're doing where. The other thing for me, Steve, through time, a real bugbear for me is there seems to have been this trend, which thankfully I think is diluting a little bit now, where the bigger you are, the more you're kind of throwing your weight around. So things like, big, some of the big retailers and manufacturers saying to, the small kind of man subcontractor, hey, if you want to work with us in this country, you are going to be the one that's going to be deemed the importer. You're going to deal with all this mess. You're going to have your systems in place because we're who we are. And if you want to trade with us, you do it our way or no way. And it was the most kind of obstructive way of doing business. Now, that would have been driven by advisors saying, well, the nil risk approach for you big guys to do this. Now, I've seen a change in that over the months because my position on this is that it takes two to tango. You're supplying your customers. This has got to work for your customers as much as you, or else you're going to lose your customers, right? So when you're pulling apart your supply chain, try and work out what works for your customer. So it's a mutual solution. Present that to your customer. Present that to your freight forwarder. Invite the other parties to come forward, give their views, put that supply chain map out there, check everybody agrees, and you've got a really fruitful conversation. But what you haven't got is hidden surprises 3 months down the line when something might go wrong. So I think that's how we kind of adopt. So I'm sure other advisors might say the same, but for me, you need to start from that and pull the supply chain apart, put it back together. And that's the most fruitful way. And finally, the other point is I had another client who was grappling with one particular issue on origin and whether goods were duty free or not when moving them into the EU. And he said, one of our competitors, we understand, has spent over £200,000 in professional fees working out this point. Now, these rules are 6 months old, and if somebody is spending, in my view, more than 10 grand on something, it's probably, it's probably unanswerable at the moment. So go and get some help from the regulatory bodies, whether it be customs or whoever it might be. If you're getting to the point where something's just, think that through. I've said, my competitor spent £200,000 working out an academic point. That doesn't sit right with me at all. So, this is about getting your supply chain to agree, but also the kind of regulators to agree, the other authorities at the ports. If your goods can get from A to B in a compliant fashion and all the parties understand the costs and who's responsible for the costs, then, you're going to be home and dry with this. Let's not overcomplicate what is an already complicated subject.
You're dead right that this is new for everybody. But speaking of what's new, we're not at the end of the journey here, are we? Because things are changing again soon. 1st of July, there's a raft of EU-led changes coming through that are supposed to make things a bit easier, but do you think that's likely to be the case?
Yeah, you're talking about the changes for B2C,
Yeah, those.
business to consumer sales. I think, yeah, there are some changes coming in from next month, as you say. I think they are positive changes that will offer a simplification for businesses, reduce VAT compliance requirements and so on around the EU. But we've left the EU now, so to take advantage of those, you need to implant your business within the parameters of the conditions that are laid out. That may require a VAT registration overseas to the extent you haven't got one. It may even require you to be established in the EU. Certainly probably will require you to think about your logistics routing and so on, but nonetheless a positive simplification coming into play next month. I think other changes moving forward that are going to be on the horizon. Obviously we've talked quite a lot about Northern Ireland. Just remains a concern for me about where that heads. There are changes coming in November anyway to think about potentially requiring some sort of establishment over there. So I think we need to pay a close eye on the way where Northern Ireland is heading. But then finally, just for me, I think that in my view, the EU will just ever tighten up the compliance rules. I think probably by this time next year, in order to be the importer into the EU, I suspect it's becoming so difficult that you need to have a company set up over there so that you're putting yourself into a position within the EU, as was the case before, when you just had a UK company when we were part of the EU. I think the more I'm seeing, a solution to a lot of the problems is to have a company over there. And whilst you don't need one, say from a tax angle, when you get into wider regulatory issues, I think that's the way forward for clients to think about. So I think tough times ahead. A lot to think about as we move forward.
Okay, so I got a lot of information there. I feel like I'm being bombarded. So imagine now that I've just come in, just switched the podcast on at this point, and you've got a 30-second elevator pitch to tell me what I need to do to make sure that my business is Brexit proof.
Sit with your supply chain team, a good advisor that is just looking at it from a helicopter view. Work with your procurement team, sales team, get all the right stakeholders in the room, ignore any kind of internal politics in that and who owns what, just get everybody in the room and map out what you do where and with who. Get that all agreed within the business, think about your business, what you do, where you want to be, then start thinking about the tax overlay, customs duty overlay. Then you must communicate that up and down your supply chain and with your freight forwarder to ensure that everybody's in agreement. If they're not in agreement, understand why, flex it, work it through, get that coherent, agreed position. Because let's face it, if you've agreed something with multiple parties in multiple countries who are equally, all those other parties looking at things from a local domestic angle at their end, if everybody's in agreement, there's a pretty damn good chance you've all got it right. If you try and do it in isolation, and certainly if you look at the tax complexities first before you do all of that, you're going to get nowhere, but you're going to spend an awful lot of money getting nowhere, and I don't want anybody doing that. So supply chain first, communication, then I think you're going to be okay.
Wow, that is definitely longer than 30 seconds. But I think you wrapped it up. But you wrapped it up beautifully. So that is absolutely fantastic. Helen, thank you for doing your best to keep Damien on track. But
I did say I'd try.
Yeah, and you did wonderfully. So thank you both of you. A really important subject, and being Brexit business proof. I'm sure I can say that better in some of the way is really important. So thank you very much, both of you, for joining me today.
Very welcome.
And thank you, Steve. Are you putting this out on vinyl?
It's not going out on vinyl.
Oh well. Well, thank you anyway.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.
You've been listening to the No Bull podcast. Share your thoughts. Find us on LinkedIn and send us a message. And subscribe to get notified of future episodes.